here today with Brent Blum, who is Executive Director of We Will Collective. So, Brent, you oversee and direct strategy and operations for the nonprofit that focuses on engaging Iowa State University's student athletes and Central Iowa nonprofits. And your career has been kind of in the business of sports. So you've been a broadcaster and producer of sports broadcasts at Iowa State with the Orlando Magic.
Correct.
NBA franchise for a time. You've been a development officer for university foundations here at Iowa State, including Iowa State with our College of Business. And been in the sports media business, which over your career, which, because I'm older than you, I consider short, but there's been a lot of change.
Oh, it has changed. And it all goes together, which is kind of how this whole genesis of the story comes together was based on media rights at the end of the day.
Yeah, so just to set the stage a little bit, I had done a case study on Ewing Kauffman, and for the book it was on his career building a pharmaceutical company, which was really interesting in of itself. But then I ran across this story of him both becoming the owner of the Kansas City Royals when the A's left town and the city really wanted a franchise. But as a small market town then and now, there's some challenges to doing that.
For sure.
But he brought an entrepreneurial kind of innovative approach with an experiment with the Kansas City Royals Baseball Academy that was really interesting, and I called it Moneyball before Moneyball. But also looking at statistics and data, which of course today is a big part of things. And so I was thinking, well, what is on kind of the leading edge of innovation in the business of sports today? And it's hard to conclude anything else except collegiate athletics.
Yes.
And Iowa State University, to some degree, has been at the center of what had been the center of the storm in conference realignments. And although that shifted, of course, out west.
For sure.
More recently.
Yes.
But I thought it would be just great to get your perspective. And so, we might start out just asking you a little bit to reflect on kind of your journey as somebody in the business of sports and where it's led to today.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's an honor to be here. And I don't consider myself an entrepreneur, but I just kind of ended up in this space in some weird way. I was talking to a donor a couple of months ago, and he said, "You realize you have a startup here, don't you?" I was like, "What? I'm not a startup. I'm just a guy running a nonprofit." He goes, "No, really, this is, for the previous 10 years, I was used to talking to CEOs and VPs and founders and angel investors. And then I was talking to him. He's like, no, that's what you are right now. I was like, I didn't even dawn on me. So it's still kind of hard to wrap my mind around why anybody would have interest in me on an entrepreneurship show podcast. But here I am.
Well, we've snuck it on.
Yeah. So it made me feel more important than I am. But no, it's, really my background is in broadcasting. I grew up here in Iowa, in Des Moines, and realized due to my lack of height and genetics, I was never going to be a professional athlete. So I knew at an early age, I always had an interest in data and math, and I loved playing and watching sports. So I knew I wasn't going to ever play. So I thought, what's the next closest thing to playing? It was either officiating, which I didn't really want to do, or broadcasting. And so growing up, I would turn down the TV of a football or a basketball game, and I would actually do the broadcast myself, and I would annoy my brothers and parents. But really, the most practice I got was playing video games. So Madden football and the old NCAA football video games. I would turn down the volume, and I would call the games that I played via video games. And it was the best practice I probably could ever do. It was the best training because, the old 10,000 hours situation, that's what I did. I would play video games and call the games. And so when I got to Iowa State in 2003, I jumped right into the student radio station, right into the student TV station. And that kind of set my path for where I wanted to go in broadcast. And ultimately, my dream was to be the voice of the Cyclones. So I got hooked up with the Cyclone Radio Network while in college, actually did the women's basketball games while a senior at Iowa State, and met John Walters, the voice of the Cyclones, developed a relationship with them. Worked in small-town radio in southwest Iowa while doing some Cyclone Radio Network things in beautiful Shenandoah. Lived above a Bretto Pizza up there. And people ask, why'd you leave Shenandoah? I said, well, if you're a single guy in Shenandoah, the options aren't plentiful. So I applied everywhere, ended up getting a job with the Orlando Magic, basically because I referenced a former Iowa State basketball player in my cover letter. I said I want to be the next person to go from Iowa State to the Magic like Kelvin Cato, who was a very average NBA player, but the hiring manager read it and said, I got to talk to that guy, because if you put Kelvin Cato in a cover letter, you're getting a call back.
Pull all the strings
Yep,
of credibility
whatever
that you
works.
can.
Yep. And so it was there for a couple of years. Ultimately, Orlando wasn't the place for me. I wanted to come back and start a family here in Iowa. So came back, was still in broadcasting, but realized it's hard to make money in broadcasting. It's a tough world. The sports media world is really tough unless you're at the high levels. And so I needed a day job, and ultimately found my way into marketing and then fundraising. So all the while I still had doing the broadcasting thing with the Cyclone radio and TV networks. Started a podcast with my friend Chris Williams at Cyclone Fanatic, back when podcasts were not even really an entity. But then my day job was doing fundraising. So started at Des Moines University down in Des Moines, which is an osteopathic medical school. And then Iowa State called me in 2017 to work for the Ivy College of Business, and had just a blast, just a complete blast doing that. And I would have stayed there with Dean Spalding, who's one of my great mentors, one of the great leaders that I think this campus has ever had, for years. But then the NIL world started changing thanks to sports media rights, which we'll get into. And somehow, some way, got asked if I'd want to participate as part of directing the We Will Collective. And about 16 months later, here we are, and we have both a nonprofit and LLC, which essentially operates as a sports marketing agency. So the nonprofit's the more visible side, but the sports marketing agency really can do those, what I would say is traditional NIL deals, and traditional being 2 years old. But those endorsements, those ambassadors of companies that Iowa State student athletes can be. And so it's really been a fun journey to this point. And essentially what my goal is to keep Iowa State afloat in this space until the adults step in and regulate in some capacity, because it really is. You get the cliches, wild, wild west, but the NIL world and college sports right now, it's never been as uncertain as it is right now. And so we're just trying to wade through the water until, with our life raft, with the We Will Collective, until things get rigged a little bit more.
Yeah, so you're coming into a market where probably other schools are doing things differently. But I think even on the website, Brent, you write that, you're trying to do things in an Iowa State way.
Yes.
So maybe if you could talk about what that Iowa State way is, and maybe contrast that with a little bit of what the Wild West looks like at this point in time, at least.
And I was not one of the founders of the We Will Collective. So I'll just Cliff Notes version. Iowa State had a couple different groups of business leaders that were approaching it both from the football side and the basketball side. So in 2021, the summer of 2021, the NCAA basically threw their hands up and said, it's a free-for-all now. There's a Supreme Court case. It got really dicey, and rather than try and legislate it out and fight in the courts, the NCAA basically said, okay, do what you want now. And it started really small. And so, your average NIL deal was maybe $500 to $1,000. Guys and gals would have T-shirts. They might do some cameo videos, a couple smaller social media posts. But leave it to the what I would say is the attorneys in the SEC to figure out, wait a second, if we pool all of our resources into these entities called collectives, we could then take thousands of donations rather than these one-off company endorsements and distribute the money that way. And so it was Tennessee, it was A&M, it was Florida, it was the who's who in the SEC who realized they're going to use this as a competitive advantage for them to take the lead in the NIL space.
Better financial deals for players under the banner of NIL might attract better talent.
Exactly. And that's exactly what the genesis was. And so Iowa State was kind of, I wouldn't say slow to react, because nobody really knew this was the direction it was going to go. And Texas was one of those schools that took advantage of NIL right away, and they have a huge donor base. And so it's pretty much one-to-one. If you have a large donor base, and this is where the fundraising part comes in, you have the opportunity to raise a lot of dollars in NIL, because essentially a lot of these things are just either they're 501c3 nonprofits and or just membership collectives where people pool their money that is distributed to the student athletes. So Texas is one of those schools that got a huge jump start. And unfortunately, Iowa State got caught on the wrong end of the bad side of NIL, or the opportunistic side of the NIL on the other end. And Iowa State's freshman of the year in the Big 12, Tyrese Hunter, got an NIL deal to go to Texas. And Iowa State did not have a collective in place, and so basically couldn't offer him anything. And so Tyrese left, and it was. So
maybe he would have left, maybe he wouldn't have. But either way,
who knows?
It was left a bit flat-footed.
Iowa State had no financial ways to keep, and it's completely allowed. and I don't know what that amount was. Tyrese was a good player, and good players, even back then, were commanding very nice figures. And so it was very much an oh no moment for everybody, specifically the basketball team, but then also the football team, because they lost then the next month a couple of their defensive players to SEC schools. And so they basically came to these business folks and said, we need to do something here. I don't know what it looks like, but we need to do something. So the We Will Collective was founded in April of 2022 in efforts to just collaborate and collect some donor dollars to keep Iowa State's best players. But realizing all along that Iowa State can't do this we're not the SEC. We just don't have that base that is just going to throw money for no reason just to get players and keep players. And so they really wanted to do something good with the NIL dollars. And so the original board members, Ryan Harkler, former football player, George Niang, obviously great basketball player at Iowa State, Dan McCarney was on the We Will board, and some other business guys in central Iowa. And they said, why can't we do some good with NIL? Let's become a nonprofit. And in order to compensate the Iowa State student athletes, they first have to engage with community projects in central Iowa. And so that's kind of where the Iowa State way comes in. These student athletes are already doing a lot of great things in the community. But this is a way to partner with them, with the Boys and Girls Clubs, with the YSSs here in Ames, with Special Olympics, with Make-A-Wish Foundation. They can participate in those community engagement activities and get paid for their NIL for good. Meaning, here in Iowa, some of our most decorated celebrities are Iowa and Iowa State football and basketball players. Mm-hmm. And so let's leverage that notoriety to help the nonprofits. But then also, if you're a donor, yes, ultimately our goal is to keep Iowa State competitive on the playing field. But if you can see the impact that is made in the community, and maybe we can make some impact with some specifically youth organizations here with these college athletes that are looked up to by those youth organizations, that's where it came from. So in the first year plus we've been around, we've partnered with over 35 nonprofits here in central Iowa. We've logged over 1,500 community engagement hours. And it's been really fun to see that part. Now, ultimately, yes, we are here to compensate the student athletes so Iowa State remains competitive. But we've also been able to do a lot of really neat things and impact this area as well. Just real quick story of how it can work in the best way. We had 10 Iowa State football players play a charity softball game against 10 Iowa football players up in Humboldt this summer for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And they sold tickets. They auctioned off jerseys. They did some fun autograph sessions. And that event raised over $150,000 for Make-A-Wish Foundation in Humboldt County. We compensated the student athletes to be there. It did not cost the Make-A-Wish anything. But it was an event. It was doing NIL for good. And really was a win for everybody. And I think people look at NIL and they go, man, what a scary world and what an ugly world. And all these guys and gals are, making millions of dollars. It's really not the case. Our goal is to just help enough to make their Iowa State experience a little bit better while also keeping Iowa State competitive as well and doing some good at the same time.
Well, that touches my heart. It's been a long, long time ago, but I had a cousin who had contracted through a blood transfusion HIV when he was young, when he had a surgery, and he was hemophiliac. So it was just a very dicey sort of a thing. And so Make-A-Wish Foundation came to him, and I remember sort of thinking, well, yeah, I mean, Matt is hemophiliac and he's got this, but gosh, he's going to be around.
Right.
And he was for a while, but he had a blood clot in his brain when he was a senior in high school and he passed away. Wow. But he got to take a trip with his classmates to Denver for Make-A-Wish Foundation. Sure. And it's a great memory for his classmates, for his family and all that stuff. So yeah, Make-A-Wish is great. And I suppose for the athletes gravitating toward youth organizations, given how youth look up to student athletes, is a natural place to be.
Yeah, and that's really where I've really enjoyed it, is making those connections, because it's twofold. It's one, those guys and gals can have a great impact on a 9 or a 10-year-old. We had a free football camp that we hosted for the Des Moines Public Schools this summer. We had 400 kids. 2/3 of them were on free and reduced lunch. They've never been to a football camp before, but we paid the Iowa State football players. We had 25 of them go down there for an all-day football camp. And who knows what connection was made during that football camp that will benefit those kids down the road. But then also for the Iowa State players, that's a connection that they make with a young person, and maybe it ingrains in them the importance of giving back or being a member of the community. And we're treating them like professional athletes. And if you're a professional athlete, you have to engage in the community. It's a big part of what you do. But the connections they've been able to make with some of these nonprofits, and we'll compensate them first. But there's a lot of these guys that have, let's say, volunteered at YSS as part of our ambassador program with them. We pay them once to be there, and then Gabe Kalster, who's a really good basketball player for Iowa State last year, was the first person we helped out with an NIL. We set him up with YSS. He went on a Thursday just to meet the kids and fulfilled his duties. He came back to us and said, "Can I just keep going back?" We're like, "Sure, Gabe, go ahead. We don't have the budget to pay you every time." He's like, "No, I don't want anything. I love the connection I made. I feel like it really helped these kids make an impact." And so he went there every single week during his senior year.
Well, they've got great mentoring programs.
Yeah, well,
there,
it's just really, it's just things that you're helping out everybody here, and I think that's been the fun part is if the Iowa State players can then make a connection, maybe that keeps them around after they graduate or after the playing career is done. So there's so many connections and auxiliary parts of this NIL for good that we're trying to do that a lot of people don't realize could be helpful for everybody in the future too. Mm-hmm. It's not just about the money in their pocket, although that helps them too. I mean, a lot of these Iowa State student athletes don't come from means. Mm-hmm. And so really what we're trying to do is make their Iowa State experience better. Just like when I was doing fundraising for the College of Business, you would try and raise money for a foreign trip or a scholarship. It's really ultimately not that different. These student athletes can't have jobs because their full-time job is being a student athlete. And and then, yes, they get a full ride scholarship, most of them, and they get room and board. But a lot of these young folks, they don't have their ability to have their parents come see them play. And so what we wanted to do with the first monies we raised, specifically for the football team, was raise enough for each scholarship player to be able to fly their family in for a game. And that's kind of our baseline. So we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's $1,500 here, $2,000 there, so mom and dad can come up for a football game.
Yeah, the things that are too easy to take for granted. It's like, well, of course your parents are going to come to some of your collegiate athletic events. Well, if they're a long ways away and they're not people with significant means,
correct,
then it's probably too much.
Yeah. And so I think that's been our challenge is how do you tell the story of, yes, ultimately college sports is changing. We want Iowa State to be competitive, but there's so many other cool things that can happen with some compensation to student athletes that they haven't been able to get before.
So you talked about the Southeastern Conference schools kind of getting out in front of this, and indeed their passion for sports is well known. I get a flashback to a story. So it was a long, long time ago. I was at the Ames Golf and Country Club, and Johnny Orr, longtime basketball coach, was there. And when he came in at the end of his round and got around a table, it was just natural to try to float over there and sit and listen.
Absolutely. I wish I
to
could have.
Stories.
Yes, I've heard legendary stories.
And so way back, probably in the late 70s or early 80s, either when he was at the end of his time at the Michigan or perhaps the beginning part of his time coaching at Iowa State, Bear Bryant, football coach at the University of Alabama and athletic director and kind of king of Alabama.
Yes.
Paid, I think, $1 more than the president of the University of Alabama
Sounds
back in those
right.
days.
Yeah.
Anyway, he brought in Coach Orr to do just a consulting project on what could we do to improve our basketball program. And so he just went and met with people, gave some suggestions. And so Coach said, we got to the end of the meeting and Bear looks at me and says, "So what do we agree to pay you for this?" And Johnny said, "Whatever the amount is." And he said, Bear Bryant pulls out from his drawer a box and starts counting out $100 bills. And so he just said to us guys at the table, "Boys, they do business in the SEC differently than we do up here in the Midwest."
That's a fact.
So how do you see things evolving? Because again, leaving aside maybe questionable business practices, but just competition. You've got different sizes of donor bases, different perhaps views of
aspirations
of how you should support student athletes.
Yes.
You talked earlier, mentioned, until an adult comes into the room. Is that ultimately what you see is something coming in to tame a little bit the Wild West nature?
I think either the market will regulate and or it will get regulated by a higher authority. So essentially, where this all started, and again, I love telling this story. When I came to Iowa State in 2003, Iowa State's athletic budget was around $25 million. Okay, so media rights were really not a thing. Iowa State, when I started at Iowa State in again '03, only 3 of Iowa State's 11 football games were even on TV. So
It's not that long ago.
it's not that long ago. The media rights explosion really happened when cable became a huge component of televised sports. So 2006 to 2010 is when this media rights explosion happened. The Big Ten Network happened. Cable operators, ESPNs of the world, they would charge the cable operators $6, $8, $10 per household. And even if you're Betty Joe in New Jersey, you still got charged for ESPN, even if you didn't watch it. And so that's where things really took off. You also had the introduction of something called multimedia rights in 2005, 2006. So Iowa State has a company called Learfield that it works with. Learfield essentially aggregates the corporate rights for Iowa State. So the Pioneer logo on Hilton, Mid-American Energy signs at Jack Trice Stadium. They sell all that inventory and then pay Iowa State an annual fee to be able to have use of all the signage, and it also includes the radio network and the TV network. All these things kind of happened, and college sports went from what I would say is an auxiliary part of the university to a full-flown business. Now, fast forward to 2023, Iowa State just signed a new TV contract with this new look Big 12. Iowa State's budget next year, once that kicks in, will be around $125 million. So in 20 years, it has literally increased budget by $100 million. And what has grown in that time? Facilities, coaches' salaries, a lot of these programs. What hasn't really grown was the player compensation. And so that's where this whole thing, eventually the players got to a point where it's like, all right, how are we not included in this? And there were some lawsuits involved. So eventually the NCAA allowed NIL as like, okay, you get this. They do get a stipend. Each student athlete at Iowa State gets a stipend that essentially the NCAA provides. It's $3,000 to $5,000 per year generally.
So runaround money, essentially.
Yeah, runaround money for being a student athlete. But really where I see it going, it'll be treated just like the professional sports at some point. Now the NCAA wants to fight against this because as soon as they allow revenue sharing or treating student athletes as employees, the whole system gets really sideways. But I do think college football in particular has grown to a point where it is too big now to be regulated within the means of academic institutions. So what I think will happen is ultimately the conferences themselves will break away from the NCAA in college football and create a revenue sharing platform with the players. So for instance, in the NFL, it's a 50-50 revenue split. The owners get 50%, or the teams get 50%, and the players get 50%. I think you're looking at a point where the conferences will have to do a revenue share with the players that sign up. And that is why all of these schools are racing to get into the biggest conferences, because everybody knows this is going to happen. It could be 3 years, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years down the road. But you want to be in the conference with the most revenue, because ultimately if that revenue is split, how do you get the best players? By paying the most. And so I think we're headed down a path where student athletes will be employees in some sort through a revenue share with the conferences or the schools themselves. And thus the arms race has now shifted from facilities and coaches, although the coaches still get compensated just fine, into this new world of NIL and revenue sharing. And so really what NIL is right now, I don't think the pie has grown that much. It's just being rearranged. Mm-hmm. And so what a lot of those schools in the SEC and the Big Ten, so Iowa State's budget is going to be $125 million next year. Somebody like Texas A&M or Michigan or Ohio State or even Iowa's budget will be about $215 million. And so what they can do is they can tell some of their donors, hey, we're getting enough in TV money thanks to the Big Ten Network and thanks to all these new TV deals. Why don't you allocate your resources over to our collective? And so the pie really hasn't grown, I don't think, with collectives. It's just now the players are being compensated through this third party called a collective. Ultimately, my feeling is the collectives will go away and the revenue share will be more formal and the student athletes will be employees of the conferences and or the schools. And we couldn't get to a point in this strange world. It sounds bizarre, but I could see it happening where each school has a football program that is affiliated with the school, but you could be the football team at Iowa State University. So you're not necessarily students at that point. You are branded on the campus as professional athletes. And that wouldn't be surprised me 10, 15 years down the road if that's where it ends up.
Yeah, because it certainly appears as sort of like the tail wagging the dog sort of a thing, football and the other sports, which is a whole bunch of things. It's the amount of eyeballs it attracts on TV, the number of people it puts in stadiums.
So here's a stat for you. Of the 100 most watched TV programs last year in the United States, 90 were NFL games, 10 were college football games. I think if people reevaluate and they realize college football is an entertainment and a TV product more than anything, and I think we've lost our way a little bit on the academic side. I'm a big believer in the power of higher education and what it can do for these young people. But the money is so much right now that the genie's out of the bottle. You can't get it back in. And so somebody in the SEC is going to continue, and the Big Ten are going to continue to push the envelope as to what they can get away with. And those two in particular may break away from the rest because they can and they have the money to.
Yeah, I've wondered that, or would they eventually get wise enough to realize that having a landscape of competitive teams from across the country probably is a more interesting entertainment product? I mean, certainly the NFL has realized that, right? That parity from a competitive perspective is better, and we all have an interest in this.
And I wonder if this summer was the tipping point for that, where nobody really cared if the Big 12 is going to break up, but all of a sudden when the Pac-12 breaks up and you have some of these historic schools, everyone in the national media goes, oh, wait a second, this isn't great. It's not great to have Cal and Stanford going to the ACC on cross-country road trips on a Tuesday night to play a basketball game. But ultimately, egos and competitive spirit get in the way. Specifically, some of those schools don't see the bigger picture. They just see, how do we win? And if you eliminate everybody else, then it ups your chance of winning. And unfortunately, that has taken the lead right now because winning means more dollars. And we haven't, nobody, there's no commissioner to step in and say, hey, everybody, this isn't good for the whole of the sport. And I don't know who that would be because right now you have all these conference commissioners from the SEC, Big 10, Big 12, acting their own self-interests and not for the interest of the sport itself.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, this podcast is The Entrepreneur's Ethic, so it's about how innovative people make decisions and the power of those decisions. And, but yeah, I mean, sort of doing things the right way has a certain power of just setting a really great example. But in a competitive sport, can you do things in the right way and still have a level of winning success that stands out enough to make the whole thing, be an example that's impossible to ignore.
Yep. And that's where Iowa State, Iowa State can't compete with the dollars in the SEC or the Big Ten. And so again, we kind of approach it of, we just have to do this in a way that makes people feel good about the direction we're going. If it comes down to a spending contest, Iowa State's not going to win. But we just kind of have to hope that we can stay afloat until something happens where the playing field is a little more equal. Because it's just gotten to a point in college sports where winning is everything. And these coaches there are 15 coaches making more than $10 million per year. And so they're not just going to slow down just because, it's good for the sport. And there's just nobody's stepping up to save college football from itself. But then I say that, and you still have games that are getting 15, 20 million viewers. So the TV executives are saying, well, why should we change anything? People are still watching. And so we haven't reached that tipping point yet where the interest is subsiding with the business of college sports. In fact, it's only gotten more viewers. And so the money isn't drying up anytime soon.
How do you think, Brent, about other sports? So football is sort of the outsized presence, but arguably, but I don't think, anyway, you can tell me if you think I'm wrong, the biggest star in the state of Iowa from a collegiate athletics perspective is Caitlin Clark.
There's no question.
A basketball player for the University of Iowa.
Yep.
And, or my other alma mater, the University of Nebraska, just had this cool event where they put 90,000 people in a stadium to watch volleyball. And volleyball is a profitable sport for the Nebraska Athletic Department. Yep. And of course, our women's basketball team here under Coach Fenley has been really successful
100%.
as well.
Yep.
And so you're getting some of these other sports that get eyeballs and have big stars as well. How do you think about the non-football sports and how that evolves?
That's what's really interesting. You've seen now, NIL it kind of follows where the dollars are, honestly. So we're kind of the trailing end here. So we support through our We Will Collective 3 sports, and that's football, men's and women's basketball. And it's no coincidence that those are the 3 most competitive in the landscape as well. But you look at some programs around the country, some of the top volleyball programs, some of the top wrestling programs. Obviously, it has its own wrestling collective, by the way. So it has a super competitive wrestling collective, and that's a not affiliated with us, but obviously it is certainly in the market in the wrestling world. In wrestling, you've got some schools are spending in the millions of dollars on wrestling in their collectives, just because they want to win. And so,
well, wrestlers are, in my experience, at least kind of crazy. So.
And competitive, right? Yeah, different group. But I respect it. But yes, so you're seeing some of those monster volleyball programs. They're spending a lot in NIL, and actually some of the highest earners in traditional NIL. So this is not collectives. This isn't the aggregate. Is some of the women's student athletes, specifically gymnastics, women's basketball, and volleyball. They've gotten a lot of endorsements as influencers. In fact, the most decorated NIL athlete since it started was LSU gymnast, because she used her fame and her influencer status as a gymnast at LSU to represent essentially brands that wanted to affiliate with her. Caitlin Clark's done the same thing. Caitlin Clark is legitimately making over $1 million in NIL compensation. Very little of it is coming from the Iowa Collective. It's all the bigger brands. So I would say that part isn't going anywhere. I mean, now, it should have been a long time ago where those student athletes could capitalize on being endorsers of products. But so Caitlin Clark has deals with Hy-Vee and Nike and some other huge brands who are using her just like Michael Jordan was used by Gatorade and Nike in the past, and well deserved. But that's yeah. So essentially, if money can be made, people will follow, and collectives are kind of the trailing end of that. I would love to get to a point with ours where we're supporting every single student athlete, but realizing the market hasn't quite shifted to softball in some areas. But for Oklahoma softball, they've got a huge support system for their softball team. So it just depends on the school and where people want to allocate their dollars. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to keep up with some days, but that's women's sports in particular. It's been fun to watch because I've always appreciated the Iowa State women's basketball program. I think women's college basketball is about to take off in the next couple of years and become right there with men's basketball from an interest level. In fact, if you look at the TV ratings for last NCAA tournament, the women's tournament was almost right on par with the men's tournament, thanks in large part to Caitlin Clark and the eyeballs she gets. She's better off staying in college than going and playing professional sports.
Yeah, and I hadn't realized until it's like, well, why didn't she go to the WNBA? And then I heard some of the numbers, and it's like, oh, she's got a bigger platform where she's at than she would probably have in the WNBA.
The Final Four for the women's for college basketball drew 5 times more viewers than the WNBA finals. You're just getting more eyeballs in college. Yeah. And I think it's the power of college sports too, and why college sports aren't going away. It's just, I think we're figuring out what's the new equilibrium of how it all works together. And you've actually seen the fear was those schools would run it high, the Alabamas and the Georgias would just be so much better than everybody. It's actually, NIL's created parity. Because some of those schools who have the bigger checkbooks, they can not all the best players are going to Alabama anymore. Mm-hmm. Sometimes some of these guys are voting with their wallets instead, and that's actually even the playing field a little bit.
Well, and I think you inspire the next generation to work harder on their craft while they're young, and this stuff floats all the way down to youth sports. And I know your kids are still pretty young, so maybe you're not experiencing all this.
Yeah, but we're getting there.
Yeah. I had a friend when my kids started to play youth sports who said youth sports are great except for the parents. So hopefully we're
not quite there, but yes,
we had good parent groups with our kids.
I've heard stories. I used to officiate youth basketball, so I've I've dealt with some in the past.
But I
yes.
I can think back to going to high school in Nebraska in the 1980s and watching the volleyball team was good back then, but watching how girls high school volleyball
Yes.
in a really small state has went to the next level and in a lot of other places too. But I think it's happened everywhere. And so, yeah, there's just better players who can go to more schools and kind of flatten the competitive landscape, if you will, because, and you see this in college football too often, depending upon who you root for. But yeah, you get teams from lower conferences that can beat Power 5 teams.
For sure. Yeah. Iowa State saw that on Saturday.
Yeah.
But and NIL doesn't guarantee success. It can help. But ultimately, it's just a part of the puzzle. And so you've even seen some schools that have really spent an NIL, but then it threw their locker room culture to pieces because player X was getting more than player Y, and it caused these locker room dynamics. So there are so many parts of this that are you're just trying to put the puzzle pieces in place. And we have a different philosophy that I'm sure than some. I mean, there's some of these schools. There are some men's basketball players who are making over $1 million in NIL. Which is more than would make in the NBA as a rookie, which I was like, what? But particularly some of these schools that don't have football programs, so your Creightons, your Marquettes, your Xaviers, your Villanovas, they don't have football players to support, so they can dedicate all of their booster NIL dollars to basketball. But it has caused unintended consequences where now there's locker room dynamics you have to worry about. If your bench guy's playing better than your starter who's making 3 times more than he is, does that cause some rift within the locker room? And it has at some places. So all these things are new, and that's why it's a wild world of. And the other part is these guys can transfer. These guys and gals can transfer for free, basically. So it's professional sports right now without a salary cap. And just think of it that way, and that's exactly what you have.
Well, I like to ask in the podcast about decisions that are the whimsical or the weird, and I don't know if it's a decision necessarily, but this summer I took some students in our summer incubator program to Okoboji for a weekend retreat, and we had a chance to meet Matt at Westo Brewery, and I'd been following lately, at least, some of the social media that you and others posted about Ames Lager, and I teased him a little bit and said, do you realize how epic it can be when Cyclone Nation gets behind a beer?
Yeah.
And he kind of did. I mean, he was expanding their capacity there significantly, and I think probably could have more from what I can tell from looking at store shelves. But could you share a little bit of that story and hopefully what fun that's been?
It's been a blast. And this is when I started at the collective, I looked at it from a fundraising perspective. So in the fundraising world, it's a pyramid. So you have your base level support, you have your mid-level, and then you have your top. And ultimately, fundraising, 80% of the dollars come from 20% of the donors. So those are your, what we call principal type gifts. Those are your naming gifts, the Ivy College of Business. Obviously, your program is named here.
I am the Rastetter Chair of Agricultural Entrepreneurship.
So those folks can really push the needle, but also you need that base level of support. And so the biggest challenge for us as a collective is, gosh, there are 61,000 Iowa State fans that fill Jack Trice Stadium. And we kind of got stuck this spring. We got to about 2,000 donors to the collective, which we were happy with. It was like, how do we reach all these people that go to Iowa State games that either don't know what NIL is or don't want to participate or don't have the means to participate, one of the three. And so we kind of, I'm not a good creator of ideas, but I like to be curious about what's working in other places. So these branded beers started to pop up around the country with athletic departments, but then also a couple collectives kind of latched on. And it made too much sense. Iowa State fans have a reputation for a couple things: showing up and drinking beer. And so if we could capitalize on that, I was like, it makes too much sense. So I went around and called a bunch of the larger brewers. The Iowa Collective had done a beer with Exile, so give kudos to them for. And we had been developing actually a bourbon with a distillery here locally, so we had the same idea. I was like, I should have probably done the beer first, but anyway, another story. So I called Exile, called some others, and said, hey, would you be interested in doing an Iowa State beer? And some of them were uncomfortable with it because they did not want to alienate half the state, which I understand. This is a very competitive, divisive issue for some places. But thankfully, Westo, we connected with Westo and found out they're an Iowa State family, and they were far enough away from Iowa City that they didn't feel like that was going to be an issue for them. And so it has just been a dream come true to see it come together. And, while Iowa State fans may not have an extra $100 per month to donate to help the collective, they're buying beer anyway. So let's meet them where they are. And if they can replace their Busch Light with an Ames Lager, they're going to do that. And it has worked tremendously well. And so it's been fun to see. So the concept was really, let's make a beer that people can tailgate with that also helps the collective. And so working with Matt and team at Westo, we threw this idea together. In our first meeting was June 1.
Oh, okay. It came together really quickly.
Yeah, it came together real fast because I basically said, Matt, here's the deal. We want something by football season. He's like, okay. He goes, do you realize how hard it is to develop a beer? I said, no, I don't. But can we do it? He's like, let's get to work. And so we had to come up with we launched essentially a new beer, a new marketing plan, a new everything in a 4-week time period. And so involved in that was more issues than I learned more about beer distribution and channels, but then also the difficult part was how do you name a beer? How do you name a beer that's not already named? How do you deal with trademarking with Iowa State? Because we're not the official beer of Iowa State, we can't have the logo, and you can't have anything close to looks like a logo. You can have the colors. And so we probably met once a day for 4 weeks. We came up with a plan, worked with Iowa State to make sure the artwork was approved, and then our marketing was really grassroots. It was social media driven. We didn't have a marketing budget. We couldn't go on TV and advertise. But I said, you know what? If we can get the Iowa State fans to be aware of it, they're gonna do their part, and it's gonna go like wildfire. And I was kind of hoping. I was like, I don't know if this is gonna work. Turns out I was right. They can't keep the beer in stock, and so we released it late August, and they're doubling their capacity for release the next month, and they're actually going to add on to the brewery. They're going to triple their footprint up in Milford, just in large part because of the success of Ames Lager and the demand. So the great part is it really.
So he was adding 3 fermentation tanks.
Yeah.
So it wasn't an insubstantial first try.
No, now they're adding on in addition. That's how great. But it helps. So essentially, a good portion of every case sold of beer goes back to us as a donation because we are a 501c3. And so every beer someone drinks not only helps a great Iowa business like Westo, but it helps the collective and thus help Iowa State student athletes experience as well. By the way, it's a really good beer. So it's been really fun to come to.
They brew really good stuff.
It's really good. And so it's been fun to work with them to see how it all comes together. And I if you would ask me 2 years ago, would I be in the beer business? What are you talking about? So it's been really cool, and man, you get a real appreciation for what actual entrepreneurs do, like Matt at Westo, who came up with this idea, and they worked their tails off to make it a reality. And now I joke with my wife that Ames Lager is like our third child, and she doesn't really appreciate that.
Well, Matt, in explaining some of his business learnings to the students that we're with, said, Okoboji is a great community.
Yes.
But it's a very seasonal one.
Yes.
So it's a lake community. And, he's like, every winter, I want the money that we've made during the busy months to have some left over when we get to the next spring. And he's like, every year, we're just hardly there.
Yep.
And so he thought about this. Number one is trying to do something good for the We Will Collective. But number two, as an entrepreneur, can we innovate this enough that it can make a positive difference in the business? And it sounds like you definitely got
it has, and it's been great. And really, I looked at it when we started, like, this is more of a marketing tool than a revenue generator for us because people still don't know what a collective does. I am shocked how many conversations I have. So how does this exactly work? What do you do? Mm-hmm. And so through this whole process of this was going to be 2 things. We'd get some money from it, but also it has helped spread the word immensely of what the We Will Collective is. And now, hopefully, we have some more brand recognition for when people see our logo. Oh, that's the one on the beer. And then we put a QR code on the beer itself so people can scan it and learn more about what we do. And so it's almost organically, with zero marketing budget, we've turned this into almost a movement of sorts where now Iowa State fans are chatting online and on message boards like, where do you find it? Where's the Ames Lager? There's a pallet here at the fairway. There's some at this Hy-Vee. And it's turned into this really fun, almost like Templeton Rye type situation where people all want to get access to the beer, but then also because of that, they're learning what it does too. So I was just at a wedding and they had Ames Lager, and had some conversations that people didn't even know that I was the collective guy and I was involved with that. They just thought the beer was cool because it's the Ames Lager, and that's exactly what the fun part is. So maybe they'll look at that can and say, well, what is this all about? And they'll learn more, and then that'll be the gateway to learning more about what we're doing as a nonprofit too.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll conclude today with having you tell a little bit of a story that won't be new for Cyclone fans, but we'll have part of our audience that we probably talk too much about Cyclone things, but hopefully is interested in sports business. Yes. But I've found through the years in a couple different ways that the Jack Trice story and where and the we will and what it means, it affects people. And so I had a friend who came up from Oklahoma, and he's reading the program. I'm embarrassed I hadn't told him the story.
Yeah,
and he
kind of take it for
and
granted.
He's an Oklahoma State guy, so he knows there's a Jack Trice Stadium.
Yep.
But he reads the story. This in every program for every home game, and he just looks at me and says, "Kevin, like, this is
amazing. Yeah,
you need to tell this story more." So I'll do that today. So tell us about Jack Trice, and we will.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. I honestly, I grew up huge Cyclone fan. I remember when Iowa State renamed the stadium it was Cyclone Stadium to Jack Trice Stadium. I didn't know at the time the movement actually came from the students to make that a reality, which makes the story even better. So for those who are unaware, Jack Trice was, I think, the first black student athlete at Iowa State. And he came to Iowa State from Ohio in the early 1920s and played in a football game. He was a really good player on the football team, but played in a football game up in Minnesota in 1923. And at the time, he had wrote a letter, and in the letter he said, basically it was, I will represent my family, my race, my university. And Jack played the game at Minnesota. During that game, and there's still some mystery as to what exactly happened, he was trampled in the game by Minnesota football players. Still undetermined if it was racially driven or it was just an unfortunate situation. Whatever the case, Jack passed away due to those injuries suffered in that football game a week later. And the story was kind of lost. So there was mourning on campus. People obviously were heartbroken. But the Jack Trice story kind of went away for 40, 50 years until Iowa State students back in the 80s and early 90s said, wait a second, why aren't we celebrating this story more? And it was a movement in the school to, one, get more attention to Jack Trice. So there's a statue involved now. Then the stadium was renamed Jack Trice Stadium. It was the first stadium in college football named after an African American, which is really cool that it's in Ames, Iowa. And so now Iowa State has really leaned into that story. And so this year is the 100th anniversary of Jack Trice's death. And so they're doing so many commemorative things. They've got a throwback uniform for that game on October 7th. Iowa State has partnered with the Trice Legacy Foundation for a lot of neat initiatives. They're doing great work for underrepresented populations here in the state. We've actually worked with them on a couple projects as well. And so where We Will comes from, instead of I Will that Jack Trice wrote, we kind of took a piece of that and turned it into We Will. And I think that really resonates with Iowa State fans of Jack's message of, I will represent the best that I can for the people in my life. And so Iowa State fans understand that message. And really, the fact that we can now help out these student athletes 100 years after the fact, and these student athletes that put their blood, sweat, and tears into this university that represents all of us, that's the connection I feel that comes back to Jack Trice. And I've gotten to know George Trice, one of the only blood relatives left, who's in charge of the Trice Legacy Foundation. Wonderful human being, and just the impact that Jack continues to have and the story that continues to get told is really, really powerful. And I know for a fact Iowa State, the student athletes are very aware of that story, and it's very impactful for them too.
Well, and I think it fits so well, with how seriously he took how he represented himself as being part of community. And so the community part of what you're doing,
exactly.
Part of the point that we try to make here for students participating in our entrepreneurship programs and students, especially from the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, come from small towns
Yes.
in Iowa and
Yep.
around the country and around the world. And it's like if entrepreneurial and innovative people don't go back to their communities and try to make a positive difference, those communities won't be around, and they certainly won't be as good. And so, you can't do everything, but you have to decide how to engage with youth organizations, how to engage with churches, how to engage with other community organizations to make things better.
Yep. And I think that's always a nice reminder sometimes is like there's a lot of headaches in college athletics right now. You're dealing with agents and money and politics and all these things. But at the root of it, that's where I come back to my higher education as a fundraiser. You're really impacting these young people at a critical time in their life. And if we can give them a little bit of money to help out back home or to make their Iowa State experience even better and help this area out by being quote unquote influencers and celebrities for a young person in this area, it can be a good thing. Like this doesn't have to be this scary boogeyman of a world with NIL. Is we can and we will do something good with it. And so it's nice to sometimes take a step back and go, okay, a lot of headaches, a lot of stress, but gosh, there's some really, really impactful things that can ultimately benefit a place that we all love, and that's Iowa State and Ames in particular.
Yeah. Well, Brent, thank you for everything you do, and thank you for sharing with us today.
My pleasure.